What's good, folks? It's your boy Allende with Authentic Alphas. And the only thing I find more depressing than people participating in a pagan holiday like Christmas is people participating in race wars and gender wars, which I think have some very, very interesting and obvious parallels. For example, both require emotion and ignorance in order to exist. Let's compare them and see how they're oh so similar. I want to make you guys think this morning. So, racism encourages so-called oppressed black people to believe that they're oppressed by white people on a whole, in general. What it shouldn't take much critical thinking to realize that the elites and the establishment is who at one time oppressed black people. Now, what does that have to do with the white population in general? Were they encouraged to look at themselves as more or better than black folk? Of course. Were they encouraged to hate black people, to belittle them, to criticize them, to be afraid of them, more importantly? Yes, absolutely, very, very much so. But how many white people, on average, percentage-wise, actually held the power to dictate laws, or the power to enslave, or the power to own slaves? When you talk about slavery, white people did not enslave black people, okay? They were maybe wealthy landowners who had plantations who might have owned slaves, but nowhere near the average white person owned slaves. It's just a ridiculous concept. This is at a time when European foreigners were migrating to America for work and opportunity. They didn't even have the resources to feed their families and children, let alone house and maintain slaves. So it's just weak thinking, and it's tribal thinking, and it's emotional thinking. Now let's compare that misplaced rage and fury and blame to what's going on with the gender war. They've convinced women of absolutely the same thing, that men on a whole is who oppress them, when again it was a very small minority. You're talking the 1% that was creating whatever laws oppressed women, or withheld the vote, or the right to own property, or whatever it is that women weren't capable of or weren't legally allowed to do in the past. It was not determined or dictated by men in general. Men don't just hold this magical power because they were born men. But yet we've convinced the modern woman to blame and hate men for the so-called patriarchy and oppressing them. Simple question time. Are men responsible for women's biggest issues today? No. Are white folk responsible for black people's biggest issues today? No, not at all. Let's see. Are women displaying self-destructive behavior? Yeah, they sure are. Well, what about black folk? Yeah, some self-destructive behavior there. So what do we see? The exact same components: ignorance, emotion, and misplaced emotion at that, and a scapegoat that can never ever satisfy or change. Because when you're talking about racism, it's a biological thing. You're born whatever color you're born. Those visual and physical differences will never not be there. Get over it. It's not something to fight and argue and divide over. When you look at men and women, once again, these are biological differences. You were born male or born female. It's not going to change. There isn't going to be any type of compromise. It's just something that you accept. Those are women, those are men. They're different. Move the fuck on. It's affirmative action putting women in classrooms and in jobs that they don't qualify for? Are we putting black students in schools simply because they're black? Are we putting them in the workplace simply to fill a color quota? We sure the fuck are. Let's see. Are men the ones telling women to rally together and have slut walks? To sleep with casual partners, just like men do? Are men the one telling women to ride the cock carousel throughout their youth and get pregnant by strangers? Are the men telling women to break up their marriages and leave their children fatherless? Nope. Are the men's telling the women's to get pregnant out of wedlock and then abort their children, which is essentially murdering your own children? Nope, sure aren't. Are white folks killing black people? Or are black men killing each other? Are white people telling black women to abort their babies at the highest rate? Nah, I don't think so. Are white folk telling young blacks in the inner cities to sell drugs to their own people? No. So this is all just a psyops, psychological operation. Divide and conquer. And it keeps the masses fighting amongst themselves rather than uniting and actually fighting for their rights. So, just the type of shit that I be thinking about. So neither white or black is better. It's just different. Neither male or female is better. It's just different. Are women allowed to openly criticize and hate men? Are men allowed to openly criticize and make hateful comments about women? Are white people allowed to openly criticize black people and make hateful comments? But are black people allowed to openly criticize white people and make hateful comments? A lot of similarities. Now, the next thing that I find interesting is both also share the similarity of being quote unquote allowed in certain spaces. Black people had segregation in the past in this country, and they weren't legally allowed to facilitate the same environments or functions as so-called white people. Now, this actually wasn't necessarily a bad thing in the sense of being separate. It was just a bad thing in the sense of it being a law that prevented people from intermingling, working together, learning together, and playing together. But as far as being to your own, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing for black people. It's a different culture, and it should be. Now, when you look at men and women, again, you see the same pattern there. Women weren't allowed in male spaces. They weren't allowed in the male cigar lounges, the male bathhouses, the male gyms, or whatever the case may be. But again, it's that same similarity. You have one demographic of people that are so-called oppressed and inferior, not being allowed to be in the same environments as the other, which is supposedly superior. So when you look at women, what have we done? We've tricked women into wanting to go into male spaces and compete alongside men. So as you can see, man, it's early, but they're starting to get to work. So I'm about done with this. Wasn't really any type of conclusion. It's just something I wanted y'all to think about, and more importantly, not participate in. Don't argue over race. Don't argue over religion. Don't argue over politics. And don't argue over gender. They're all just divisive tools to keep us distracted from what's really important. Peace.